The wagon lurched violently to the left, throwing Natalie Preston against the wooden side as the axle snapped with a sound like thunder across the empty Wyoming landscape. And she knew in that instant that her carefully planned journey to meet her intended husband in California had just become a fight for survival. Her father's letter had arrived 3 months ago at their Boston home, informing her that the marriage arrangement he had made with a wealthy merchant in Sacramento would secure her future and his business interests. Natalie had packed her trunks with dutiful resignation, hired a guide and driver named Mr. Henderson, and set out on the long journey west. She was 22 years old, educated, and had never known true hardship until this moment when the wagon tilted at an impossible angle and her driver cursed loudly before jumping from his seat. "The axle is completely broken," Henderson said, wiping sweat from his weathered face as he examined the damage. It was late August in 1882, and the heat pressed down on them like a heavy blanket. "We are still 2 days from Riverton, Wyoming, and I cannot repair this here." Natalie climbed down from the wagon carefully, her traveling dress already covered in dust. Around them stretched nothing but sagebrush and rocky terrain, with the distant line of cottonwood trees marking where the Popo Ag River cut through the landscape. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. "What do you suggest we do?" she asked, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. Henderson scratched his beard and looked uncomfortable. "I will ride one of the horses back to the last settlement we passed. It is only about 15 miles. I can bring back tools and another man to help with repairs. You should wait here with the wagon and your belongings." The thought of being left alone in this vast emptiness made her stomach clench with fear, but she saw no alternative. They had passed the small settlement that morning, and it was the only sign of civilization they had seen in days. "How long will you be gone?" "I will ride fast. If I leave now, I can be back by tomorrow afternoon with help." He was already untethering one of the horses from the wagon. "You have water and food in the supplies. Stay with the wagon. Do not wander off, Miss Preston." She wanted to protest, to demand that he take her with him, but she could see the logic in his plan. The horse could move faster with only one rider, and someone needed to stay with the wagon and all her possessions. "Very well. Please hurry." Henderson mounted the horse and tipped his hat to her. "I will be back as soon as I can." Then he urged the horse forward and rode off toward the east, leaving Natalie standing beside the broken wagon in the growing twilight. She spent the first hour organizing the interior of the tilted wagon, making a space where she could sleep that night. Her trunks had shifted during the accident, and she carefully repacked the items that had spilled out: dresses, books, her mother's silver hairbrush, letters from her father. The familiar objects gave her some comfort as darkness fell over the land. The night was surprisingly cold after the heat of the day. Natalie wrapped herself in blankets and tried to sleep, but every sound made her jump. Coyotes howled in the distance, and something rustled through the sagebrush near the wagon. She had never felt so alone in her entire life. In Boston, she had been surrounded by servants, neighbors, the constant noise of the city. Here there was only silence and the vast star-filled sky above. When dawn came, she was exhausted and frightened but determined to maintain her composure. She rationed the water and food carefully, ate a small breakfast, and then settled down to wait. The day grew hot again, and she sought shade beneath the tilted wagon, trying to read one of her books to pass the time. The words swam before her eyes. All she could think about was Henderson returning with help. By mid-afternoon, her water was running low. She had been foolish with it during the night, drinking whenever her throat felt dry without thinking about conservation. The settlement was 15 miles away, Henderson had said. Even riding hard, it would take several hours to get there and back. She told herself not to worry yet. But as the sun began to sink toward the horizon again, and there was no sign of anyone approaching, real fear began to set in. What if Henderson's horse had gone lame? What if he had been thrown and injured? What if he had simply decided that helping her was not worth the trouble and had kept riding? She had paid him half his fee up front, but the remainder was supposed to be paid upon reaching California. Perhaps he had decided that amount was not enough. The second night was worse than the first. Natalie finished the last of her water in the morning and realized she would have to do something or die of thirst waiting beside the wagon. The line of cottonwood trees marking the river was visible in the distance, perhaps 2 miles away across the rough terrain. Henderson had told her not to wander off, but Henderson had also promised to return, and he had not. She filled a cloth bag with a few essential items, a knife, matches, a blanket, and began walking toward the river. The sun was already climbing, and each step across the rocky ground was treacherous in her leather traveling boots. She had to stop frequently to rest, her throat so dry she could barely swallow. The 2 miles felt like 20. By the time she reached the cottonwood trees, she was dizzy and stumbling. The sound of running water was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. She half fell, half slid down the riverbank and plunged her hands into the cool water, drinking deeply. Only after her thirst was satisfied did she sit back and look around. The Popo Agie River was not wide, perhaps 30 feet across at this point, but the water ran clear and fast over smooth stones. Cottonwoods and willows lined both banks, their leaves rustling in the hot breeze. Natalie felt tears sliding down her cheeks, tears of relief, exhaustion, and fear all mixed together. She had water now, but she was still alone and lost. Even if Henderson returned to the wagon with help, he would not know where she had gone. She should have left a note. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She should have marked her direction somehow. But it was too late now. She could never walk back to the wagon in her current state. All she could do was stay here by the river and hope that someone would find her. Natalie spent the rest of that day in a kind of daze. She drank more water, tried to catch fish with her hands, a ridiculous effort that accomplished nothing, and eventually ate some wild berries growing on bushes near the water. She had no idea if they were poisonous, but hunger overrode caution. As darkness fell again, she wrapped herself in her blanket beneath one of the cottonwood trees and tried not to think about what would happen if no one came. The 4th day since the wagon accident dawned bright and clear. Natalie's dress was torn and filthy, her hair had come completely loose from its pins, and she suspected she looked like something from a nightmare. She sat at the edge of the river, dipping her sore feet in the cool water, and tried to formulate a plan. Should she start walking? But which direction? Riverton was somewhere to the northwest, she thought, but she had no real sense of distance or direction. She could easily walk in circles until she died of exposure. The sound of a horse made her heart leap. She scrambled to her feet, looking frantically up and down the riverbank. They're coming from the north, a rider on a dark horse. For a moment, she thought it might be Henderson, but as the figure drew closer, she could see this was someone else entirely. The man was tall in the saddle, wearing a broad-brimmed hat pulled low against the sun. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone who had spent his entire life riding. As he approached, Natalie could make out more details: a weathered face, broad shoulders, dusty work clothes. A cowboy, she thought, though she had only seen such men in illustrations back east. He pulled his horse to a stop about 20 feet from where she stood and dismounted in one smooth motion. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, Natalie bedraggled and desperate, the stranger wary and assessing. "Madam," he said finally, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was deep and rough like gravel. "You look like you have been through some trouble." Natalie's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "My wagon broke down. The driver left to get help 3 days ago and has not returned. I had no more water, so I came to the river. Please, I need help." The cowboy's expression shifted from wariness to concern. He moved closer, and Natalie could see his face more clearly, probably in his late 20s, with sun-bronzed skin, a strong jaw shadowed with stubble, and startling blue eyes that seemed to take in every detail of her situation at once. 3 days. Where is your wagon now?" She pointed vaguely toward the east. "That direction, maybe 2 miles, I do not know exactly. You walked here alone." There was something in his voice, not judgment, but a kind of serious concern that made her want to cry again. "I had no choice. The water was gone." She swayed slightly, and suddenly he was there, his hand on her elbow steadying her. "Easy now. When did you last eat something substantial?" "I do not remember. Yesterday, I found some berries." He made a sound low in his throat that might have been a curse, and gently guided her to sit on a fallen log near the water's edge. "Wait here." He went back to his horse and returned with a canteen and some wrapped packages from his saddlebags. "Drink this slowly, and here jerky and bread. Not fancy, but it will help." Natalie accepted the food with shaking hands. The water from his canteen was cool and clean, and the jerky, though tough and salty, tasted like the finest meal she had ever eaten. She forced herself to eat slowly, aware that his blue eyes were watching her carefully. "What is your name?" he asked after a few minutes. "Natalie Preston. I am traveling from Boston to California." "Quentin Ashford," he said. "I work for the Triple Bar Ranch about 10 miles north of here. I am out looking for strays that wandered off during the last storm." He paused. "Natalie Preston from Boston. You are a long way from home." "Yes." She did not want to explain about the arranged marriage, about her father's business dealings, about how she had never wanted to make this journey in the first place. "Thank you for the food, Mr. Ashford. I do not know what would have happened if you had not come along." His expression turned grim. "Nothing good. This is hard country, Miss Preston, especially for someone alone and unprepared." He studied her for a moment longer, then seemed to come to a decision. "I need to take you somewhere safe. The nearest town is Riverton, about 20 miles northwest from here. I can take you there, get you to the hotel, and then we can figure out what happened to your driver and your wagon." Relief flooded through her so powerfully that she felt dizzy again. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Quentin moved back to his horse and began adjusting the saddle. "Can you ride?" "I have ridden, but not much, not Western saddles." "Well, you are about to learn. Come on." He helped her up onto the horse first, then swung up behind her with athletic grace. Natalie found herself sitting sideways across his lap, his arms on either side of her as he held the reins. She could feel the solid warmth of his chest against her back, and she was acutely aware that this was the closest she had ever been to any man who was not family. In Boston, such contact would have been a terrible scandal. Out here, it was apparently necessary for survival. "Hold on," Quentin said, his voice close to her ear. "We will take it slow since you are not used to this." He urged the horse forward, and they began making their way along the riverbank. The motion was smooth, but still required Natalie to grip the saddle horn tightly. She was conscious of every place their bodies touched, of the strength in the arms that kept her secure, of the faint scent of leather and horse and something else, wood smoke, maybe, or sage. "How did you end up out here alone?" Quentin asked as they rode. "Your driver just left you." She explained about the broken axle, about Henderson riding back for help, about waiting and finally having to seek water at the river. Quentin listened without interrupting, but she could feel the tension in his body increasing as she talked. "Your driver was an idiot," he said bluntly when she finished. "He should never have left you alone like that. Something must have happened to him, or else he is the kind of man who takes money and runs, which amounts to the same thing for you." "I thought I was going to die out there," Natalie admitted quietly, "but you did not. You made the right choice going for water." His tone softened slightly. "That took courage, Miss Preston. A lot of people would have just sat by that wagon until it was too late." She had never thought of herself as particularly brave. In Boston, her life had been one of social obligations and expectations. The most daring thing she had ever done was refuse to wear a corset to a dinner party once, and even that small rebellion had resulted in a lengthy lecture from her father. But out here, courage meant something different. It meant walking 2 miles across rough terrain when you were dying of thirst. It meant accepting help from a stranger, because the alternative was death. They rode in silence for a while. The landscape around them was harsh but beautiful in its own way, rolling hills covered in sagebrush, distant mountains purple against the sky, the occasional pronghorn antelope bounding away at their approach. The sun beat down mercilessly, but Natalie was too grateful to be rescued to care much about the heat. "Tell me about Boston," Quentin said eventually. "What is it like?" She was surprised by the question. "It is very different from this. Crowded. Buildings everywhere and streets full of people and carriages. The ocean is nearby, and in winter, everything freezes. There are theaters and libraries and shops with goods from all over the world." Sounds nice. But there was something in his voice that suggested he was just being polite. "Do you prefer it here?" she asked. "I have never known anything else, so I cannot really compare. But yes, I prefer open country. I like being able to ride for miles without seeing another soul. I like working with cattle and horses, sleeping under the stars. The cities I have visited, Denver, Cheyenne, they felt cramped and noisy to me." "And dangerous," Natalie added, remembering the stories she had heard about western towns. Quentin made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Madam, I have been robbed twice in Cheyenne and never once out on the range." Dangerous is relative. They talked more as they rode, the conversation flowing more easily than Natalie would have expected. Quentin asked about her family, and she told him about her father's shipping business, about growing up in a world of social expectations and rigid propriety. She asked about his work, and he described the life of a ranch hand, the long days, the hard physical labor, the satisfaction of working with animals and the land. "You own the ranch you work for?" she asked. "No. I have been saving money to buy my own spread someday, but land is expensive even out here. I have been working for Mr. Davidson at the Triple Bar for about 5 years now. He is a fair boss, pays decent wages. I figure another 3 or 4 years, and I will have enough to make a down payment on a small ranch of my own." There was determination in his voice that Natalie found compelling. This was a man with a plan, working toward a concrete goal. It was so different from the men she had known in Boston, who inherited their money and positions and never had to truly work for anything. The sun was beginning to set when the buildings of Riverton finally came into view. It was not a large town, just a main street with wooden storefronts, a church steeple rising above the other structures, corrals and barns on the outskirts. But to Natalie, it looked like salvation. Quentin guided his horse down the main street, drawing curious looks from the people they passed. Natalie was aware that she must look terrible, filthy, disheveled, clinging to a strange cowboy on his horse. She did not care. All that mattered was that she was safe. He stopped in front of a 2-story building with a painted sign that read Riverton Hotel. "This is the best accommodation in town," he said as he dismounted and then helped her down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet touched the ground, and again his hand steadied her. "Easy. Let me get you inside." The hotel lobby was small but clean, with a desk where a middle-aged woman looked up in surprise as they entered. "Quentin Ashford. What have you brought here?" "Mrs. Miller, this is Miss Natalie Preston from Boston. She was stranded when her wagon broke down and her driver abandoned her. She needs a room and probably a hot bath and a good meal." Mrs. Miller's expression shifted immediately from surprise to maternal concern. She bustled around the desk and took Natalie's arm. "You poor dear. Of course, of course. Come with me, Miss Preston. I will get you settled right away." She glanced at Quentin. "You did right bringing her here, Quentin." "I am going to check with the sheriff about her driver and wagon," Quentin said. "Miss Preston, you are in good hands now. Mrs. Miller will take care of you." Natalie felt a sudden, irrational panic at the thought of him leaving. This man had saved her life, and she barely knew him. "Will I see you again?" He paused, his blue eyes meeting hers. "I will come by tomorrow to let you know what the sheriff finds out about your wagon. Try to get some rest, Miss Preston." Then he was gone, the door closing behind him, and Natalie was left with Mrs. Miller, who was already steering her toward the stairs and talking about hot water and clean towels and beef stew from the kitchen. The next few hours passed in a blur of relief and exhaustion. The hot bath was heaven, washing away days of dirt and fear. Mrs. Miller provided a clean nightgown and helped her wash her hair, clucking sympathetically over Natalie's sunburned face and blistered feet. The beef stew was simple but delicious, and Natalie ate every bite before collapsing into the soft bed and sleeping for 12 hours straight. She woke to bright sunlight streaming through the window and the sound of wagons and voices from the street below. For a moment, she could not remember where she was, and then it all came flooding back: the broken wagon, the desperate wait by the river, Quentin Ashford appearing like something from a dream. Mrs. Miller had cleaned and mended her traveling dress as best she could, and Natalie dressed carefully, trying to make herself look presentable. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman she barely recognized. Her face was sun-darkened. Her hair was different even after being washed, and there was something in her eyes that had not been there before. She looked like someone who had survived something. She was eating breakfast in the hotel dining room when Quentin arrived. He had cleaned up as well. She noticed fresh clothes, shaved face, hair still damp as though he had just bathed. Without the layer of trail dust, he was even more handsome than she had realized, and she felt her cheeks warm at the thought. "Miss Preston," he said, removing his hat as he approached her table. "How are you feeling this morning?" "Much better, thank you. Please sit down." "Have you learned anything about my wagon?" He pulled out a chair and sat across from her, his expression serious. "The sheriff sent a couple of men out to where you described, and they found your wagon. Everything was still there: your trunks, your belongings. But there was no sign of your driver or the horse he took." Natalie felt her stomach sink. What does that mean? Could mean a lot of things. He might have had an accident. He might have decided the job was not worth finishing. "The sheriff is going to check with the settlement to the east, see if anyone saw him there." Quentin hesitated. "The wagon axle can be repaired, but it will take some time and cost money. You have funds to cover that." "I have some money. My father gave me enough for the journey." She had not counted it in days, but the small purse with her cash and banknotes had been in the cloth bag she carried to the river. "How much will it cost?" "Probably around $40 for the repair and transport into town. Then you will need to hire a new driver if you plan to continue to California." $40 was a significant amount, but Natalie had twice that in her purse. The real problem was what came next. I do not even know if I want to continue to California, she said quietly. The man I was traveling to meet, it was an arranged marriage. My father set it up for business reasons. I agreed because that is what dutiful daughters do, but now. She trailed off, not sure how to explain the feeling that had been growing in her since she left the wagon. Now I am not sure that is the life I want. Quentin was quiet for a moment, studying her with those intense blue eyes. What kind of life do you want? It was a question no one had ever asked her before. Her father had told her what she would do, and she had never thought to question it. But sitting here in this rough Wyoming town, across from a cowboy who had saved her life, Natalie felt something shift inside her. I do not know yet, she admitted, but I know I want to choose for myself. A slow smile spread across Quentin's face, transforming his serious expression into something warm and approving. That is a good start. Over the next few days, Natalie settled into an unexpected routine in Riverton. The hotel room became her temporary home while the wagon was repaired and brought into town. Mrs. Miller proved to be a font of information about the area and its people, and Natalie found herself genuinely interested in learning about this place that was so different from everything she had known. Quentin stopped by the hotel each evening after finishing his work at the ranch. At first, he claimed he was just checking to make sure she was all right, but soon they both stopped pretending there was not another reason for his visits. They would sit in the hotel parlor or walk along the main street in the evening cool, talking about everything and nothing. Natalie learned that Quentin had been born in Texas, that his parents had died when he was 14, that he had worked various ranch jobs throughout the West before settling in Wyoming. He was 27 years old, had never been married, and was devoted to his dream of owning his own land. He read when he could mostly newspapers and practical books about ranching, and had taught himself to be handy with tools and repairs. He learned that Natalie had been educated at a finishing school, that she loved to read novels and poetry, that she had always felt constrained by the expectations of her social class. She was an only child, and her father had been grooming her to make an advantageous marriage since she was 16. She had never had a choice in her own life until now. "What will your father do when you do not arrive in California?" Quentin asked one evening as they sat on the hotel porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "I wrote to him today," Natalie said. "I explained what happened with the wagon and told him I am staying in Riverton for the time being. I also told him I will not be marrying Mr. Patterson in Sacramento." She had agonized over that letter, knowing how angry her father would be, but also knowing she could not continue with the arranged marriage. Not now, not after everything that had happened. "That took courage," Quentin said quietly, "or foolishness. He may disown me. Would that be so terrible?" She thought about it honestly. Her father's money had always come with strings-attached expectations, obligations, the constant pressure to be the perfect daughter. "No," she said finally, "I do not think it would." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Quentin said, "I have been thinking. Mr. Davidson's wife is looking for help in the ranch house. Their daughter got married and moved away, and Mrs. Davidson is not as young as she used to be. It is not fancy work cooking, cleaning, some bookkeeping, but it would provide income and a place to stay if you need it." Natalie turned to look at him. "You would suggest me for this position." "I already did. I told Mrs. Davidson about you, and she said she would like to meet you. If you are interested, that is. I know it is not what you are used to." "Quentin, I am interested. I am very interested." The idea of honest work, of earning her own way, was suddenly more appealing than anything Boston had ever offered her. The next day, Quentin took her out to the Triple Bar Ranch. The ride was much more pleasant than their first journey together. Natalie sat in front of him on the horse again. But this time, she was clean and rested, and able to actually appreciate the landscape and the feeling of security his presence provided. The triple bar was larger than she had expected, with a main ranch house, several barns and outbuildings, and extensive corrals where horses and cattle moved in the afternoon heat. Mrs. Davidson proved to be a warm, practical woman in her 50s who looked Natalie over with sharp eyes and asked direct questions about her background and abilities. "I will not lie to you, Mrs. Davidson," Natalie said. "I was raised to manage servants, not to do the work myself. But I am educated, I can keep books, and I am willing to learn whatever you need me to know. I need honest employment, and I promise I will work hard." Mrs. Davidson smiled. "I appreciate the honesty. The work is not difficult, just steady. We need someone reliable, someone with a good head on her shoulders. Quentin spoke highly of you, and I trust his judgment. When can you start?" "As soon as you would like." "How about tomorrow? We have a small cottage behind the main house where our daughter used to live. It is yours if you want it part of your wages, along with $30 a month in meals." $30 a month was probably a pittance compared to what Natalie's father spent on her clothes alone back in Boston, but she felt a rush of pride at the offer. This would be her money, earned by her own efforts. "I accept. Thank you, Mrs. Davidson." Moving into the cottage at the Triple Bar Ranch marked the beginning of a new chapter in Natalie's life. The cottage was small but comfortable, one main room with a bed, a table, and a stove, plus a smaller room she could use for storage. It had a window that looked out toward the mountains and a small porch where she could sit in the evenings. The work was harder than anything she had done before, but Mrs. Davidson was a patient teacher. Natalie learned to cook for the ranch hands, to keep the household accounts in order, to preserve food for the winter months ahead. Her hands, which had always been soft and pampered, developed calluses. Her back ached at the end of long days. But she also experienced a satisfaction she had never known in her old life, the satisfaction of a job well done, of being genuinely useful. And through it all, there was Quentin. She saw him every day now, at meals in the ranch house, or when he came in from working with the cattle. Their conversations continued and deepened. She learned to read the subtle expressions on his face, to know when he was tired or troubled or pleased. He learned her moods just as well, could tell when she was homesick for something she could not quite name, or when she was happy simply to be where she was. One evening in late September, about 6 weeks after her arrival at the Triple Bar, Natalie was sitting on her cottage porch when Quentin rode up. He dismounted and tied his horse to the porch rail, then came to sit on the steps beside her. "Long day?" she asked. "Long enough." We moved about 50 head to the north pasture. They were not particularly cooperative. He stretched his legs out and tilted his head back to look at the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "This is my favorite time of day, when all the work is done and it is just quiet." "Mine too." She was acutely aware of how close they were sitting, of the warmth of his body beside hers on the cooling evening air. "Natalie, I need to say something to you." The seriousness in his voice made her pulse quicken. "What is it?" He turned to look at her, and even in the fading light, she could see the intensity in his eyes. "That day I found you by the river, I told myself I was just helping someone in trouble. That was all it was supposed to be. But the more time I spend with you, the more I realize that was not all it was. Not for me." Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I am falling in love with you. I am saying that when I think about my future now, about that ranch I want to buy, I see you there with me." I know it is fast, and I know you might not feel the same way, but I needed you to know." He took a breath. "I will not leave you lost out here again, Natalie. Not in any way. If you will have me, I want to build a life with you." For a moment, Natalie could not speak. Emotions welled up inside her: joy, fear, hope, certainty. This man had saved her life and then given her the space to figure out who she wanted to be. He had never tried to control her or change her. He simply saw her, truly saw her, in a way no one ever had before. "Quentin," she said softly, reaching out to take his hand. "I love you too. I think I started falling in love with you that first day, even though I was too frightened and confused to recognize it. You gave me back my life when you found me by that river, and every day since then, you have shown me what it means to choose my own path. Yes, yes, I want to build a life with you." He stood up and pulled her to her feet, his hands gentle but certain as they framed her face. "I am going to kiss you now, if that is all right." "More than all right," she whispered. His lips met hers, and the kiss was everything she had never known. She was waiting for, tender and passionate and full of promise. When they finally drew apart, both of them were breathless. "We should probably tell Mr. and Mrs. Davidson," Quentin said, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Probably," Natalie agreed. "Though I suspect Mrs. Davidson already knows. She has been giving me knowing looks for weeks now." He laughed, a sound of pure happiness that made Natalie's heart soar. They walked hand in hand to the main ranch house, where Mr. and Mrs. Davidson were indeed not at all surprised by their news and offered congratulations and best wishes. The wedding took place in early November in the small Riverton church. Natalie wore a simple dress she had sewn herself, with Mrs. Davidson's help, pale blue cotton with white lace trim. She carried wildflowers that had somehow managed to survive the early frosts. Quentin wore his best suit, and when he saw her walking down the aisle toward him, the expression on his face made her feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. There was no one from her old life in attendance. Her father had responded to her letter with a terse note disowning her and informing her that she was no longer welcome in his home. She had cried when she received it, but Quentin had held her and reminded her that she was not losing a family, she was gaining a new one. And it was true. The church was full of people from the Triple Bar Ranch and the town of Riverton who had welcomed her in the past months. Mrs. Miller from the hotel sat in the front row and dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Mr. and Mrs. Davidson stood as witnesses. The other ranch hands had cleaned up and come to town for the occasion. These people, who had been strangers to her just a few months ago, were now her community. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and when Quentin kissed her, the congregation burst into applause and cheers. They celebrated with a simple reception in the hotel dining room, with food and dancing and toasts to the happy couple. That night, Natalie and Quentin returned to the cottage, which was now officially theirs. Mr. Davidson had agreed to sell Quentin a parcel of ranch land on favorable terms, and they were already making plans to build a proper house come spring. But for now, the cottage felt like a palace. "Are you happy?" Quentin asked as they stood together looking out at the star-filled Wyoming sky. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Natalie said truthfully. "When I was sitting by that river waiting for help, I thought my life was over. I never imagined it was actually just beginning." He pulled her close, and she rested her head against his shoulder. "I meant what I said that first night on your cottage porch. I will never leave you lost again, Natalie. We are in this together now, whatever comes." "Together," she agreed and sealed the promise with a kiss. The first winter of their marriage was harsh but wonderful. Snow piled high around the cottage, and the wind howled across the open range. Inside, Natalie and Quentin created their own warmth. She continued her work in the Davidson house, and he continued his work with the cattle. In the evenings, they would sit by the stove and make plans for their future, where exactly they would build the new house, how many cattle they would start with, what they would name their ranch. "What about the Preston Ranch?" Quentin suggested one night. "No," Natalie said immediately. "I do not want my father's name attached to what we are building here. This is ours, something new." She thought for a moment. "What about River's Edge, in memory of where we met?" Quentin smiled. "River's Edge Ranch, I like it. It has a good sound." By spring, they had saved enough to begin building their house. Quentin did most of the work himself, with help from other ranch hands on their days off. Natalie watched the structure take shape, a modest 2-story home with a large kitchen, a sitting room, and 3 bedrooms upstairs. 3 bedrooms because they were already hoping for children to fill them. They moved into the new house in June of 1883, exactly 1 year after the wagon accident that had brought them together. Natalie stood in the empty rooms and marveled at how much her life had changed. A year ago, she had been a frightened woman stranded in the wilderness. Now she was a rancher's wife with her own home, her own life, her own choices. The River's Edge Ranch grew slowly but steadily. Quentin proved to be as good a rancher as he had been a ranch hand, with an instinct for cattle and horses that served them well. Natalie managed the household accounts and proved to have a good head for business. They worked hard, saved carefully, and reinvested their profits back into the ranch. In the spring of 1884, Natalie gave birth to their first child, a son they named Thomas, after Quentin's father. The labor was long and difficult, with only Mrs. Davidson and the local midwife in attendance. But when Natalie finally held her baby in her arms, she forgot all the pain. Quentin stood beside the bed with tears running down his weathered face, touching the tiny hand with one calloused finger. "He is perfect," Quentin whispered. "You are perfect." "Thank you, Natalie." Thomas was a healthy, boisterous baby who seemed to have inherited his father's adventurous spirit. By the time he was 2 years old, he was already trying to ride anything that moved and getting into every kind of mischief. Natalie and Quentin took turns watching him while the other worked, though in truth, they both spent as much time with their son as possible. In the fall of 1886, their second child was born, a daughter they named Caroline. She was smaller and quieter than her brother, with her mother's dark hair and her father's blue eyes. Natalie had been worried about having a difficult labor again, but Caroline slipped into the world easily, as though eager to join the family. The years passed in a rhythm of work and family and love. The River's Edge Ranch expanded gradually: more cattle, more land, a bigger barn. They hired a hand to help with the heavy work, a young man named Pete who reminded Quentin of himself when he was starting out. Natalie taught both Thomas and Caroline to read from the books she had brought from Boston, determined that her children would be educated even in this remote place. In the evenings, after the children were asleep, Natalie and Quentin would sit on the porch of their house and watch the sun set over their land. Sometimes they talked about the day's work or made plans for the future. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, content to be together. "Do you ever regret it?" Quentin asked one evening when they had been married for 5 years. "Giving up your old life, I mean, the money and the comfort and all that." Natalie looked at him in genuine surprise. "Not for a single moment. That was not really living, Quentin. It was just existing in a pretty cage. This," she gestured to the land around them, to the house they had built, to the window where their children slept peacefully. "This is living." "I just wanted to make sure," he said, pulling her closer. "Because I wake up every morning grateful that your wagon broke down that day, even though I know you went through hell before I found you. If it had not happened, you would be in California right now, married to someone else, and I would be alone in a bunkhouse somewhere, still dreaming about having my own ranch. Well, I am grateful too, in a strange way. I am grateful that I was forced off the path that had been laid out for me and had to find my own way. And I am grateful that when I was waiting by that river, lost and frightened, you were the one who came along. She turned to kiss him softly. You kept your promise, you know. You told me you would not leave me lost out here again, and you never have. Not once. As the 1880s drew to a close, the River's Edge Ranch had become one of the more successful small operations in the area. Quentin's reputation as a fair dealer and skilled rancher had spread, and buyers sought out their cattle. Natalie had become known in Riverton as well, not just as Quentin's wife, but as a woman of intelligence and capability in her own right. She had started a small lending library in town, donating many of her own books and organizing fundraisers to buy more. The women of Riverton gathered there once a month to discuss what they had read. Thomas was now 6 years old and already helping his father with small tasks around the ranch. Caroline was 4 and followed her mother everywhere, learning to cook and sew and keep house. Natalie looked at her children sometimes and marveled at how different their upbringing was from her own. They were growing up with freedom and purpose, learning that hard work had value, understanding that life was not about social position but about character and love. In the spring of 1890, Natalie discovered she was pregnant again. This third pregnancy was harder than the previous 2. She was 30 years old now, and her body did not bounce back as easily. But Quentin was attentive and worried, insisting she rest more and taking on additional household duties himself. The baby, another son they named James, was born in December just as winter settled over Wyoming. The labor was difficult, and for a few frightening hours, both Natalie and the baby were in danger. But Mrs. Davidson and the midwife worked together with skill and determination, and finally, James took his first crying breath. "No more," Quentin said when he finally came in to see his wife and new son. His face was pale, his hands shaking. "I cannot go through that again, Natalie. I cannot risk losing you." She was too exhausted to argue, but she squeezed his hand and smiled weakly. "No more," she agreed. 3 children are plenty. James proved to be worth the difficult entry into the world. He was a cheerful baby with a sunny disposition that brightened even the coldest winter days. Thomas and Caroline doted on their little brother, and the house was filled with laughter and the chaos of a growing family. By 1892, the River's Edge Ranch had grown to over 300 acres with a herd of nearly 200 cattle. They had built an addition onto the house, a larger dining room, and an indoor bathroom with water pumped from their own well. It was considered quite luxurious by local standards, and Natalie took great pride in the home they had created. That summer, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived addressed to Natalie, forwarded through several addresses before finally reaching Riverton. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and when she opened it, she found it was from a lawyer in Boston. The letter informed her that her father had died of a heart attack 3 months earlier. He had not changed his will after disowning her, which meant his entire estate, the house, the business, all his assets had been left to a distant cousin, who was now contesting the will on the grounds that Natalie should have been included as the rightful heir. Natalie sat down heavily at the kitchen table, the letter trembling in her hands. Her father was dead. She had not spoken to him in 10 years, and now she never would. The pain that struck her was surprising in its intensity, not grief for the cold, controlling man he had been, but grief for the relationship they might have had if he had been different, if she had been different. Quentin came in from the barn and immediately saw her distress. "What happened?" She handed him the letter wordlessly. He read it quickly, his expression darkening. "I am sorry, Natalie. I know he was not kind to you, but he was still your father. The lawyer wants to know if I intend to contest the will. There could be a substantial inheritance if I do." She looked up at her husband. "What do you think I should do?" Quentin sat down across from her. "That depends. Do you want the money? I do not know. We are doing well here. We do not need it. But it was my family's business, my mother's money too, before she died. Maybe it should not all go to some distant cousin I have never met. Those are fair points." He was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Here is what I think. Write back to the lawyer and tell him you are not interested in fighting over the estate. But if the cousin wants to settle things fairly, you are willing to accept whatever inheritance your mother would have wanted you to have. That way, you are not being greedy, but you are not giving up what is rightfully yours either." It was good advice, and Natalie followed it. She wrote a carefully worded letter to the lawyer, explaining that she had not been in contact with her father for 10 years, that she had built a good life for herself in Wyoming, and that while she was not interested in a lengthy legal battle, she did believe she was entitled to some portion of her mother's estate. The legal process took nearly 2 years to resolve, with letters going back and forth between Wyoming and Boston. In the end, a settlement was reached. Natalie received a sum of $5,000, less than half of what she would have inherited if her father had not disowned her, but still a substantial amount of money. When the bank draft arrived in the summer of 1894, Natalie and Quentin sat at their kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. $5,000, Quentin said quietly. "That is more money than I thought I would ever see in my entire life." "What should we do with it?" Natalie asked. They discussed it for several days, considering their options. They could expand the ranch significantly. They could invest it in town businesses. They could save it all for their children's futures. In the end, they decided to do a combination of things. They used $2,000 to buy an adjacent parcel of land, doubling the size of the River's Edge Ranch. They put $1,000 into an account in Cheyenne for their children's education and futures. And they used the remaining $2,000 to help establish a proper school in Riverton, something the growing town desperately needed. The Riverton School opened in the fall of 1895 in a new building funded partly by the Ashfords and partly by other families in the area. It had one teacher, a young woman from Denver named Miss Sarah Hartley, and 23 students, including Thomas, Caroline, and James Ashford. On the first day of school, Natalie stood with Quentin watching their children walk through the schoolhouse door, and she felt her eyes fill with tears. "What is wrong?" Quentin asked, concerned. "Nothing is wrong. Everything is right. I am just thinking about how far we have come. 10 years ago, I was sitting by a river thinking I was going to die. Now look at us. We have this beautiful family, this ranch. We are helping build a school. It is more than I ever dreamed possible." Quentin put his arm around her waist. "We built it together, you and me." "Together," she agreed, leaning into his solid warmth. The late 1890s brought challenges and triumphs. A hard winter in 1896 killed off some of their herd, but they recovered the losses the following year. Thomas, now a teenager, had grown into a capable young man who worked alongside his father with skill and dedication. Caroline showed a talent for drawing and painting, covering the house with her artwork. James was 11 now, funny and adventurous, always bringing home injured animals he insisted needed rescue. Quentin and Natalie had aged as well, though they still felt young when they were together. Quentin's hair had threads of gray at the temples, and the sun had etched deeper lines around his eyes. Natalie had a few gray hairs of her own, hidden among the dark, and her hands bore the marks of years of hard work. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the young people who had fallen in love by a river in the summer of 1882. One evening in the summer of 1899, the entire family was sitting on the front porch after dinner. Thomas was whittling something from a piece of wood. Caroline was sketching the sunset, and James was telling an elaborate story about a snake he had seen near the creek. Natalie sat in her rocking chair, watching her family with contentment, while Quentin sat beside her, occasionally adding details to James's increasingly fantastical story. "Papa," Caroline said suddenly, looking up from her sketch, "tell us again how you met Mama." It was a story the children had heard many times, but they never seemed to tire of it. Quentin glanced at Natalie with a smile, and she nodded. "Well," Quentin began, "it was the summer of 1882, and I was out looking for stray cattle near the Popo Ag River." As he told the familiar story, Natalie's broken wagon, her desperate wait for help, his discovery of her by the river, Natalie watched her children's faces. They listened with rapt attention, even though they knew every word. When Quentin got to the part where he promised not to leave her lost out there again, Caroline sighed romantically, and Thomas rolled his eyes in typical teenage fashion, though Natalie could see he was pleased by the story too. "And now here we are," Quentin finished, 17 years later with 3 wonderful children and the best ranch in Wyoming. "Second best," Thomas said with a grin. "The Hendersons have more cattle than we do." "Quality over quantity," Quentin replied, ruffling his son's hair. "And besides, they do not have you 3, which makes us the winners by default." Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, Natalie and Quentin remained on the porch. The summer air was warm and still, filled with the chirping of crickets and the distant sound of cattle lowing in the pasture. "You think the children understand how lucky we are?" Natalie asked. "I think they understand that we love each other and we love them. The rest, all the history, everything we went through to get here, they will understand better when they are older and have their own lives to compare it to." "I suppose you are right." She reached over and took his hand. "Thank you, Quentin." "For what?" "For keeping your promise. For 17 years of not leaving me lost. For this life we have built together." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Natalie, finding you by that river was the best thing that ever happened to me. You changed everything. You gave me purpose and love and a family. I should be thanking you." "Then we are even," she said with a smile. As the years moved into the new century, the Ashford family continued to thrive. Thomas married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring spread in 1903, and they built their own home on the far end of the river's edge property. Caroline, to everyone's surprise, moved to Cheyenne in 1905 to study art at a new school that had opened there, though she promised to visit often. James, practical like his father but with his mother's intelligence, announced his intention to study veterinary medicine so he could help the ranch animals and others in the area. Quentin and Natalie became grandparents in 1904 when Thomas and his wife had their first child, a little girl they named Natalie in honor of her grandmother. Holding that baby for the first time, Natalie was overcome with emotion. This tiny person represented a future that stretched forward beyond her own life, a continuation of the love story that had begun by a river more than 20 years earlier. In the spring of 1907, Natalie and Quentin celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary. The children insisted on throwing them a party, inviting people from all over the county to celebrate. The ranch house was filled with friends and neighbors, with food and music and laughter. People gave speeches about the Ashfords, about Quentin's fairness and skill as a rancher, about Natalie's contributions to the community through the library and the school. But the best moment came late in the evening when the crowd had thinned and most people had gone home. Quentin took Natalie's hand and led her outside, away from the house, to a spot on a small rise where they could see the whole ranch spread out before them in the moonlight. 25 years, he said. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like we have always been together. I know what you mean. I can barely remember what my life was like before you. It is like that other person, the Boston girl, was someone completely different. She was someone different, but she was also the beginning of you. You took all that strength and intelligence and courage she had and used it to build something real out here. He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. I love you, Natalie Ashford. I loved you when you were a frightened woman by a river. I loved you when you were learning to be a rancher's wife. I loved you through 3 pregnancies and countless hard days, and I love you now. I will love you until the day I die and probably beyond that. Tears slipped down Natalie's cheeks. I love you too, Quentin. You saved my life in every way a person can be saved. You gave me freedom and purpose and a family. You showed me what real partnership looks like. I cannot imagine my life without you in it. They kissed under the stars, 2 people who had found each other in the vast wilderness and chosen to build a life together through love and hard work and unwavering commitment. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and sorrows. Quentin's health began to decline in his late 50s, nothing serious, just the accumulated wear and tear of a lifetime of physical labor. He finally agreed to let Thomas take over most of the ranch management, though he still supervised and offered advice. Natalie developed arthritis in her hands, making some tasks difficult, but she refused to slow down completely. She still kept the household accounts, still participated in the library committee, still had dinner on the table every evening when Quentin came in from his daily inspections of the ranch. Caroline returned from Cheyenne in 1910, with a husband, a lawyer named David, who was fascinated by the West and eager to be part of ranch life. They settled in Riverton, where David opened a small legal practice, and Caroline continued her artwork, selling paintings of Wyoming landscapes to buyers as far away as Chicago. James completed his veterinary training in 1912 and returned home to set up practice, operating out of a small clinic built near the main ranch house. By 1915, Thomas and his wife had given Quentin and Natalie 3 more grandchildren, and Caroline and David had 2 of their own. The River's Edge Ranch had become something of a family compound, with multiple homes and generations all working together. Sunday dinners at the main house were chaotic, loud affairs with grandchildren running everywhere and adults catching up on the week's events. One Sunday evening, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, Natalie was washing dishes when Quentin came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "You remember what you said to me the night I asked you to marry me?" he murmured in her ear. "I said yes," Natalie replied, leaning back against him. "You also said I had given you back your life, but Natalie, you gave me mine too. Everything good in my life started the day I found you by that river. Everything." She turned in his arms to face him, looking up at the man she had loved for more than 30 years. His hair was mostly gray now, his face deeply lined, but his blue eyes still held the same warmth and strength that had drawn her to him that first day. "We gave each other everything that mattered," she said softly. "We gave each other love and family and a life worth living." As they stood there in their kitchen, holding each other in the lamplight, Natalie thought about the scared young woman who had waited by a river for help that she thought might never come. She thought about the cowboy who had promised not to leave her lost again, and had kept that promise every single day since. She thought about all the years of work and love and building something from nothing, and she felt grateful beyond words for the turn of fate that had brought them together. Quentin and Natalie lived well into their 70s, both of them sharp-minded and relatively healthy despite the physical toll of their years of labor. They saw their grandchildren grow up and begin to have children of their own. The River's Edge Ranch continued to prosper under Thomas's management, and James's veterinary practice had expanded to serve the entire county. Caroline's paintings hung in galleries and homes across the West. On a warm summer evening in 1922, exactly 40 years after Quentin had found Natalie by the river, they sat together on their front porch as they had done countless times before. They were watching the sunset, their hands linked, comfortable in the silence that came from a lifetime of truly knowing another person. "You ever wonder what would have happened if that wagon axle had not broken?" Natalie asked suddenly. Quentin considered the question. "I try not to." "It would have meant you ending up in California with a man you did not love, and me still working someone else's ranch, probably alone. I much prefer what actually happened. Even though I gave you such a scare that first day," he squeezed her hand. "Especially because of that. It showed me what you were made of, pure strength and determination, and it gave me the chance to make a promise I have been honored to keep every day since. The promise not to leave me lost again," Natalie said softly. "That is right. And I never have I? Not once. Not ever." She smiled at him, her face showing all the lines and marks of a life fully lived. "And I will never let you be lost either. We are in this together, remember, whatever comes." "Whatever comes," he agreed. They sat together as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the Wyoming sky in brilliant shades of orange, pink, and purple. Around them was the ranch they had built together, the family they had raised, the community they had helped create. The legacy of a love story that had begun with a desperate woman waiting by a river for help and a cowboy who had promised never to leave her lost again. In the years that followed, Quentin's health gradually declined. He remained sharp and engaged with life, but his body finally began to give out after 76 years of hard use. In the spring of 1927, he developed pneumonia that his aging lungs could not fight off. Surrounded by Natalie, their children, and many of their grandchildren, Quentin Ashford passed away peacefully in the bedroom of the house he had built with his own hands 44 years earlier. Natalie grieved deeply, but not desperately. She had been blessed with 45 years of marriage to a man who had truly loved her, and she had loved him just as deeply in return. She lived another 3 years after his death, spending time with her family, writing down the story of her life for her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and visiting Quentin's grave every week to tell him about what was happening at the ranch. She passed away in her sleep in the summer of 1930, on a night when the window was open and the sound of the river could be heard faintly in the distance. Her children found her in the morning, peaceful and still, with a photograph of Quentin in her hand and a smile on her face. The story of a woman who had been brave enough to choose her own path, and a man who had been honorable enough to walk beside her. The story of a broken wagon axle and a desperate wait by a river, and a promise made and kept. The story of true love found in the most unexpected place, in the wild heart of Wyoming, where two lost souls had found each other and built something that lasted forever. And on quiet summer evenings, when the wind rustled through the cottonwoods by the Popo Ag River, local people would sometimes swear they could hear laughter and whispered promises, carried on the breeze the echo of a cowboy telling a frightened woman that he would not leave her lost out here again, and the sound of her saying, "Yes, I will build this life with you, whatever comes." Together,